Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, the Southeastern Asia. I just learned while having my very late breakfast and while watching CNN that former US President George Herbert Walker Bush passed away yesterday on November the 30th, 2018 at the age of 94. So far he has been the longest lived US president. Late presidents Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan passed away at the age of 93, while then decades earlier Herbert Hoover passed away at the age of 90, more specifically in 1964, and the second US president John Adams passed away in 1826, incidentally on July the 4th of that day, hours after his successor and rival and eventual friend Thomas Jefferson had passed away. The first late President Adams was also 90 years old. George Bush's passing makes former President Jimmy Carter, who turned 94 on October the 1st, 2018, the longest lived, the oldest surviving US president. So Jimmy Carter is over 3.5 months younger than the now late President Bush was. George Herbert W. Bush, was born in Massachusetts, but then after graduating from Yale University, where he majored in economics, he moved to Texas. Already in high school, he had fallen in love with Barbara Pierce, and they got married in 1945 after George had been discharged from the US Air Force following the end of the Second World War. They had 6 children, 2 of whom are, of course, by far the most famous. Their oldest son and at the same time oldest child, George Walker Bush, who served as the 43rd US president from 2001 to 2009. And then Jeb Bush, who served as the Florida governor, I think from 2007 to 2015. Most members of the Bush family are Episcopalians. There are 2 exceptions as far as the children are concerned. Following his conversion to Christianity around 1986, George W. Bush became a Methodist, and then in order to marry, or due to his marriage to his Mexican-American wife Columba, Jeb Bush converted to Roman Catholicism. The now late first presidential Bush couple were also close friends of the late Reverend Billy Graham and his wife Ruth for decades, and they often met in the Bushes' summer retreat or summer cottage of Kennebunkport in Maine. The late President Bush's mother, Dorothy, was a devout Episcopalian Christian, and according to Billy Graham, also George and Barbara Bush were. George Bush publicly stated that he believed in Jesus Christ as his personal savior. He read the Bible, according to William A. de Gregorio, a presidential biographer, daily with his wife. However, George Bush did not feel exactly comfortable with the Christian right or the moral majority, although he did, in principle, for example, oppose abortion except in cases of rape, incest, and threat to the pregnant wife's or girl's life. Interestingly enough, the late Mrs. Bush believed in pro-choice. The late President Bush was a wealthy man. The wealth was acquired largely through work in the oil industry of Texas, or in one of the oil businesses of Texas, of course, and of course thrift and so forth. George Bush became politically active in the 1960s. In 1964, he unsuccessfully ran for the US Senate in Texas, losing to Democrat Ralph Yarborough, who interestingly enough, and quite rarely enough at that time, was a genuinely liberal Democrat. However, George Bush was clearly more popular in Texas at the time of those federal elections of the United States than was the back then solidly conservative Republican presidential candidate, Senator Barry Goldwater. In 1966, Bush ran as a moderate and easily defeated his Democratic opponent in elections to the US House of Representatives. In 1968, if I remember correctly from William A. de Gregorio's book, he had no major opponents. In 1970, he decided not to seek re-election to the US House of Representatives, even though his seat was safe. Instead, he decided again to run for the US Senate. After a tough campaign, he lost to Democrat Lloyd Bentsen, receiving over 46% of the vote, but Bentsen still got over 53% and prevailed. Following this, the US President at the time, fellow Republican Richard Nixon, appointed Bush as the UN ambassador, in other words, the US ambassador to the United Nations. Then in 1973, George Bush moved to become, or changed jobs to become the national or federal chairman of the Republican Party. Then he became the US liaison officer, tantamount to ambassador, because the United States didn't yet have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. In 1976, then President Ford appointed him as the director of CIA. He had to resign in 1977 because the new president at the time, Jimmy Carter, preferred to appoint a man of his own choice. In 1980, George Bush was a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination, but as we know, he lost to Ronald Reagan. However, Reagan decided to appoint him as the Republican vice presidential candidate. And as we know, in November 1980, the Reagan-Bush ticket easily defeated the incumbent President Carter and the incumbent Vice President Walter Mondale with about 51% of the vote. And then in 1984, they were overwhelmingly elected or re-elected with about 59% of the vote over the Democratic vice presidential candidate, former Vice President Walter Mondale, and the Democratic vice presidential candidate, Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro. During his 2 terms as U.S. Vice President, before his own presidential campaign in 1988, George Bush kept a low profile. He never publicly disagreed with President Reagan, but he then had those private working lunches with Reagan where he made his disagreements, if any, politely known. In 1988, he managed to defeat several other candidates for the Republican presidential nomination, including Senator Robert Dole and televangelist Pat Robertson. And then in the general election campaign, he defeated then Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, receiving over 53% of the vote. According to James John Guy, a Canadian political scientist, George Bush indeed was supported by over 85% of the voters who had supported Reagan. Whether this meant the ones who had supported Reagan in 1984 or both in 1980 and 1984, he did not specify. The start of George Bush's single term as president was rather successful for him. The US economy was still growing quite healthily in 1990. However, 1991 was a recession year. The United States was caught, in the words of President Bush, in a global economic slowdown. Most memorably, Bush led the Allied coalition of the United States and several other countries, including Saudi Arabia, against Iraq, which had occupied and annexed Kuwait back in August 1990 in the First Persian Gulf War from January to February 1991. The coalition easily won the war, and there were only some hundreds of casualties. However, the United States-led coalition decided not to press on to capture Baghdad, the Iraqi capital, or to topple Saddam Hussein. After the First Persian Gulf War was successfully won, Bush's popularity rating peaked at 91%. Sometime in the summer of 1991, either in June or July or early August of that year, it was still 78%, and it looked as if President Bush would be unbeatable by any potential Democratic opponent in 1992. However, the unthinkable happened. In the last months of 1991, with the lingering recession and the gridlock between President Bush and the still Democratic-controlled Congress, meant that few major laws were passed unless they were diluted in a major way, and Bush started to face growing criticism from his own party, especially from its right wing, and especially after the conservative Republican, later he would be a member of the Reform Party, Pat Buchanan, who had served as a spokesperson for the Reagan administration, decided to challenge Bush for the nomination. He was in trouble. In January 1992, plagued by sinking opinion polls, his approval rating had tumbled to just 40%, a remarkable slide in the absence of a major scandal. Here I'm paraphrasing William A. de Gregorio. Bush announced his candidacy for re-election, although he was able to defeat Buchanan and his other opponents in all the Republican presidential primaries that still distracted attention from him. In August 1992, he officially was re-nominated for president by the Republican National Convention in Houston, Texas. The tone of the convention was, according to many members of the media and many moderate and liberal Americans, too conservative, largely dominated by the Christian right and by Pat Buchanan, who called for a religious war for the soul of the United States. In the general election campaign, Bush faced not just Democrat Bill Clinton, who was then serving as governor of Arkansas, but also a fellow Texan, computer billionaire Ross Perot, who had decided to run as an independent in the spring of 1992, had temporarily suspended his campaign in July of that year when Clinton had been formally nominated for president by the Democratic Party. But at the start of October, just weeks before the presidential election, had re-emerged as candidate, claiming that neither the Republicans nor the Democrats had effectively addressed the issues that concerned the American people. And as we know, despite the best of his efforts, Bush lost on November the 3rd, 1992, to Bill Clinton by about 5.5% of the popular vote, and decisively in the Electoral College, receiving only 168 electors from 18 states, while Clinton prevailed with 370 electors from 32 states and Washington, D.C. However, after his defeat, he said to his supporters, "We've had wonderful 4 years. No one can take that away." One of the reasons for Bush's defeat was the perception that despite the easy US-led coalition's victory over Iraq in the first Persian Gulf War, not that many jobs were created during his presidency. Then he had agreed back in June 1990 to a series of tax increases which affected not just the upper class but also the middle class Americans in order to avoid a protracted budget showdown in the face of foreign policy turmoils with with the Democrats. At that time, the tensions between Iraq and Kuwait were already increasing, culminating in the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait at the start of August 1990. Famously, Bush had vowed repeatedly during his 1988 successful presidential campaign, "Read my lips, no new taxes." During his 1992 re-election campaign, he had apologized for the tax increase, calling it a mistake, and had all but vowed not to raise taxes should he be re-elected president. In the final weeks of his administration, he announced a continuation or either the deployment of US forces in the war-torn Somalia, something that his successor Bill Clinton then cancelled. In December 1992, he pardoned former US Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger of any crimes that the latter may have committed during the so-called Iran-Contra scandal. That came back to haunt Bush during the later stages of his presidency. He had claimed that he was out of the loop. In other words, he did not know that confidential and potentially compromising or even criminal information that the administration's inner officials, or many of them, did know, resulting in the conviction of at least one senior US military officer, Colonel Oliver North, and then of at least one top administration official, Caspar Weinberger. Anyway, the issue was that in 1986, more specifically November of that year, just in the wake of the US congressional midterm elections, the controversial weapons sales between Americans and Iranians became known. And with the proceeds of those weapons sales, Iran was then locked in an indecisive war against its western neighbor Iraq. The United States was able to buy weapons for the right-wing Contra rebels who were fighting against the socialist/communist president of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, in Central America. Also, there was some controversy over over Bush's removal of the Panamanian military dictator General Manuel Noriega, although of course those who favored democracy and democratization basically approved of the fact that Noriega was removed and imprisoned. Leaving office in January 1993, Bush kept, during his more than 25 years of retirement, largely a low profile, although of course he did endorse a number of Republican candidates for high offices, especially for president. He wrote his memoirs. He divided up his time between his main home in Houston, Texas, and his summertime home in Kennebunkport, Maine. And he still followed the world events quite keenly until his final years. Eventually, in the early 2010s, he had to start using a wheelchair, which may have been somewhat of a humiliation because he had been an active sportsman, especially a jogger, since the 1970s. His wife Barbara passed away several months ago. They had been married since 1945. And yes, on the evening of November the 30th, 2018 came the end of his earthly life. May God bless and comfort his family and friends, and may God rest his soul. Bye bye for the time being.